All right, so Luke chapter 7 is where we will be. And we're going to get back into the miracles of Jesus. And tonight we pick up with Jesus raising the widow's son. Now, at the end, I'm going to ask you a question, but we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So tonight we do pick back up with our miracles. You know, there are so many great miracles to look at. So many miracles that there are lessons to be learned from them. But the greatest miracles that we find in Scripture are obviously the ones where Jesus did what no one else could possibly do. And that is where he raises the dead to life. Those are the most amazing miracles. And the Bible only records 3 such miracles performed by Jesus, not including the miracle of Jesus raising himself from the grave. And tonight's miracle, in my view, is perhaps the least well-known of the resurrection miracles. And in my mind, it is probably the least discussed resurrection miracle. The other 2 instances that are recorded in Scripture, we know those very well. One of those is the raising of Jairus' daughter, and we know that story. We love to we hear sermons about that, and we know a lot about that. We also know even better than that story. We know the story of the raising of Lazarus, and you can't help but hear messages about that almost every year. It seems in many pulpits around the nation. Luke is the only gospel account to tell us about this particular miracle. In fact, the only one of the 3 resurrection miracles to be found in more than one gospel is the raising of Jairus' daughter, which is found in both Matthew and Mark. Luke tells us of this resurrection, and John tells us the resurrection of Lazarus. What is also interesting is that each of these resurrection miracles occurs at a different stage of death. Jairus' daughter, when she was raised, had only been dead for a few hours. The widow's son that we're going to look at had been dead long enough for them to prepare him for burial and begin to carry him to the graveside. Lazarus, we know that one well. Lazarus, he not only had already been placed in his burial site, he had been dead for 4 days. And so each of these resurrection miracles occurs at different stages of death. The point being that when you look at these resurrection miracles, for Jesus, it didn't matter where they were. It didn't matter how long they had been dead. Christ still had the power to raise them. And the same thing is true spiritually. No matter how young or how old you may be, no matter how long a person may have been a sinner or how great a sinner they are, Christ can still bring them to life and save any sinner. And so with that little introduction out of the way, let's read our story, the account of this miracle, and let's look at Luke chapter 7, beginning in verse 11. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." And then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. As we look at this story, there are a few things that I want to share that I borrowed from several individuals like Warren Wiersbe and Kent Hughes, and and John Butler, and I just, there was so much in this story that I wanted to share, and so I gathered from a lot of folks and just really tried to put together what I felt like was going to be the most impactful to us tonight. And so as we look at this story and we look at what takes place here in this miracle, the first thing that we need to notice is the sorrow that we find before the miracle. Notice again with me verses 11 and 12. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain. Now I'm going to stop here just for a moment. You might be wondering, what is it talking about? The day after. The day after is the day after our last miracle. Anyone remember what our last miracle was? It's like, preacher, that was 2 weeks ago. How can I remember that? I don't even remember what I ate for lunch yesterday. That's okay. It was when Jesus healed the centurion's servant. He was up in Capernaum and he healed this centurion's servant. And we are told that the next day he's on his way to this city called Nain. And many of his disciples, back in verse 11, went with him and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. There are two types of sorrow that we find here in this passage that was going on before the miracle ever took place. The first sorrow was a public sorrow. Understand that it was likely late afternoon when Jesus and the large crowd following him arrived and approached the city of Nain. As they arrive to the city, they encounter an unexpected display of sorrow at the city gate. Here, as they are coming upon the city, they find a funeral procession with a young man being carried on an open coffin. No doubt within this group, we're told there was a large group following this coffin out of the city. And no doubt in this group, there were professional mourners who were being paid to lead the large wailing crowd. Understand, in their society, when someone died, you paid people to come in and to actually mourn and to wail and to lead people in all of this mourning and wailing. It's very interesting that they did this, but you paid people to do that. And in that, as they led the people, you would have the flutes and the cymbals and the people crying out in their frenzied cries. It would have been a deafening experience because this wasn't just any death. It was the death of an only child. In fact, what we really find is it was the death of an only son, which in biblical times was an event to be mourned than any other death, more than any other death. When an only son died, it carried great significance. It required and was expected that there would be even more mourning over this person. The crowd understood the significance of the moment. And as they followed, they publicly mourned the loss of this young man. Think about the contrast that we see taking place here as Jesus and his group arrive and this crowd following the widow and her dead son. Jesus and his disciples are rejoicing in the blessings of the Lord. They've just seen Jesus heal the centurion's servant the day before. There is a jubilance, there is a joy, a happiness as they are approaching this city. But the widow and her friends who are exiting the city are lamenting the death of her only son. You can't have two more opposite groups coming and meeting head on. One excited and happy and jubilant, and the other mourning and sad. Jesus was heading for the city, while the mourners were heading for the cemetery. Spiritually speaking, each and every one of us can be found in one of those two crowds. If you have trusted Christ, you're following him into the city, aren't you? You're following him into the city of Zion and that new Jerusalem that he is preparing for us. But if you're not following him, then you're following death out to the cemetery. You see, one of these two groups is the group you're in. Either the group heading into the city or the group heading to the cemetery. And so, just incredible imagery there. So we have this public sorrow. Secondly, and more importantly, there was a private sorrow. There was a private sorrow. The most striking person in this story is the woman. Here is a woman attending the funeral of her son. Her husband is already dead. As far as we can tell from the story, she has no other children, and it is clear that this was her only son. For this woman, this was the most tragic situation she could find herself in. I know there are some in this room who have had the unfortunate experience of going through the death of a child and having to deal with that. But multiply that to the point where you have your only son, and that son is now dead, and your husband is dead, and there is no hope for you, because that's her situation. This was the most horrible situation she could find herself in, and Jesus immediately sees and understands this woman's plight. As she tearfully follows the corpse of her only son, she feels a private sorrow that no one else in the large crowd following this coffin can imagine. Oh, they can say all the platitudes. They can say, oh, we understand. Or they can say, God bless you. And they can say all those things. But not one of them understands what she's truly feeling in that moment. Here's this large crowd following the proceedings, and yet for this woman, she now finds herself, in spite of the crowd, all alone in this world. She has no one left to provide for her, and she has no one left to protect her. You see, because in biblical times, women really had no means of supporting themselves, and they were completely dependent on the men in their family to care and provide for them. And so she knew that with her husband dead and her only son dead, there was no one left to care for her. There was no one left to provide for her and to protect her. And so as she made this trek, she knew that tomorrow she would wake up all alone, brokenhearted, with no one to help her, because this crowd would disappear. That is what Jesus sees when he sees this woman. He sees a woman who all hope is lost. And that's where we come to Jesus' reaction. Jesus' reaction, we come to it and we look at verse 13. Verse 13, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. So as this bereaved mother stumbles her way toward the burial ground, she has no idea that a miracle was coming her way. This miracle stands in total contrast to the previous healing of the centurion's servant. Remember back to that healing. The centurion was seeking the healing. That healing, he had faith. Everything that took place there was expected and even hoping for. But for this woman, she's not asking Jesus for help. She's not looking for help. She's not expecting help. Faith is not even to be seen in this moment. Instead, to her, all hope is lost. She doesn't get a miracle because of her faith. And that's important for us to understand. The miracle doesn't come because of her great faith. Instead, she gets a miracle because Jesus had compassion. That's it. The miracle came because Jesus had compassion on her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. It doesn't say that she came running up to him, Jesus, will you raise my son back to life? He doesn't do any of that. She doesn't do any of that. Instead, Jesus saw this tragic scene, and his heart sank for this woman. Luke uses the strongest word he can to describe the compassion and pity that Jesus had for this woman. The root word for this word compassion comes from the root that refers to what is inside. It refers to like the heart, the liver, the lungs. In other words, this word compassion, it describes an emotion that has a physical effect. In other words, Jesus didn't just feel sorry for this woman. No, it affected him so much emotionally that it affected Jesus physically. That's the idea behind this word compassion. It wasn't just an emotional thing. It was so deep that it affected him physically. Have you ever felt a sorrow for someone that went beyond, I'm so sorry for your loss? But instead, that sorrow and that compassion could be felt down into your very core. You see, that kind of compassion was very normal for Jesus. When Jesus observed Mary and Martha one day in the future weeping for Lazarus, John 11 says that he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Again, that's an interesting word, that word groaned. It comes from an ancient word that describes a horse's snorting. So when you hear that Jesus groaned, it's a word that describes a horse snorting. What it's indicating to us is that the Lord let out an involuntary gasp, as in the breath just went out of him. That compassion led him then to trembling. Listen, Jesus felt for the two sisters so much that he had a physical reaction. It took his breath. And then his compassion in verse 35 led to the shortest verse in the Bible, where Jesus wept. You see, it wasn't just a surface compassion. It was a compassion that moved him physically. When Jesus saw the widow of Nain, Jesus was again inwardly convulsed with compassion. It affected him physically. His compassion for her was grounded in his sinlessness and his selflessness. You see, for us, too often our sin and focus on ourselves inhibits our ability to care and have compassion for others. Sin keeps me from caring for others as I should. Focusing on myself keeps me from having the compassion I should for others. But it didn't affect Jesus that way, because he was sinless and he was selfless and he was able to fully exercise his sympathy and his pity for this poor woman. That shows us that Jesus has a heart that's big enough for any sorrows. It doesn't matter what sorrow you're going through. His compassion is real. His empathy is real. And it is deep. Lamentations 3, verses 22 and 23. Listen, we love this verse, and it's one of the foundations of one of the greatest hymns ever written. Lamentations 3:22 says, his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. What? Great is your faithfulness. You see what it's saying? Listen, God's compassion, it overcomes whatever sorrow you're feeling. You may be going through a hurt and a pain that no one on this earth can possibly understand. You may be hurting so much you can't even express the pain. But God understands it completely. He's not hindered by our personal limitations. And his compassions, they fail not. Instead, they are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness to us. So, understand Jesus had compassion on her. Secondly, Jesus soothed her with his words. Notice again it says, when he saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Now, that sounds like a strange thing to say, doesn't it? She's following her dead son. And he looks at her and says, don't weep. Stop crying. Now, here's where we're going with this. Jesus didn't just feel compassion for her. He let that compassion move him to actually help her. And he did that first by his words. Don't weep. Stop crying. Now understand, he's not telling her to suppress her emotions. He's not saying, well, listen, if you're going to be a good Christian, you need to forget about all that crying and everything else and all that emotion, and you just need to be rock solid. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying, stop being such a wimp and grow up a little bit. All right? He's expressing a genuine care for her And guess what? By telling her, don't weep, stop crying, it's going to be okay, he's giving her a hint at the miracle that's about to happen. He's coming up as the master of the universe, and he's saying, listen, stop crying, it's okay. I've got this. It's this moment where he's coming in, and moved by her tears, he gives her that gentle imperative. Don't go on crying. Because he was about to do what no one in the crowd expected. So he begins to soothe her with his words. But he doesn't leave that by itself. Instead, he follows it up with action. Where we see in verses 14 and 15 that Jesus raises the dead. It says, then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Now listen, there are three significant aspects to this miracle that I want you to see. First of all, I want you to notice that Jesus' touch defied death. His touch defied death. Understand, according to the ceremonial law in the Old Testament, if an individual touched the coffin of a dead person, that polluted the person who touched the coffin, and it made them ceremonially unclean. But Jesus knew and understood something important, that the law required mercy more than sacrifice. And so Jesus took charge of the situation. He tells the woman, stop crying, don't cry. And he goes over and he touches the coffin. He doesn't care that the person is dead. That's not an issue for him. That's not going to stop him from doing what needs to be done. And so it says he came and touched the coffin, and those who carried him stood still. With just the touch of his hand, Jesus brought this procession, this funeral procession, to a screeching halt. Before he ever said a word, the very fact that he touched this coffin caused everyone to stop dead in their tracks. All the wailing, all the mourning, it ceased, and a silence settled in. Life and death were now face to face, and that's what I love about this moment. Jesus is life, and he is face to face with death, and he's about to show death who the victor is. That's what I love here. And so he is about to have this showdown with death, which Paul, as we saw in our study of 1 Corinthians, Paul described death as the last enemy that will be destroyed. Do you remember 1 Corinthians 15, verses 54 and 55? It says this, so when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? You see, death couldn't stop Jesus. We see that eventually when he gets to the cross and dies and raises from the dead himself. But in this moment, he's showing everyone that he is the one who is the victor over death. He has the power over death. It doesn't matter what that ceremonial law says. He's not worried about being clean or unclean in that moment. What he cares about is showing death who's really in charge. And so his touch defied death. Secondly, what we see here is that Jesus issued a simple command. Just get the picture. Everyone in this group is standing absolutely still. They never expected someone to come up and just touch the coffin. That's a no-no in society. They're shocked that anyone do that. He's willingly choosing to make himself seem to be unclean. We know as the sinless Son of God that he could not be made unclean. But as everyone is standing in this silent shock, Jesus breaks the silence by issuing a simple command. Look at what he says. Young man, I say to you, arise. Young man, I say to you, arise. When Jesus performed certain miracles, miracles that we consider to be lesser miracles. You know, we kind of categorize miracles. Some are bigger and harder, and some are lesser. When we think about some of these miracles that he did, he would often combine some of these miracles with a specific action. The actions were usually meant to instruct. Remember the man with the withered hand. What did he tell the man to do? Stretch out your hand to be healed. And there was an action there to show that. But when it came to resurrections, he used only his word. It seems clear that he wanted people to understand that the power of resurrection is his and his alone. And what's interesting is that when he spoke to this young man's lifeless body, he heard him. Think about that. This dead young man heard Jesus' voice. The young man was dead physically, but he was fully alive somewhere because he heard Jesus and he came back to life physically. This helps remind us that for humans, death is only the death of this physical body, but our soul and our spirit lives on. So this young man, he heard it. And that brings us to the third point here. And that is that Jesus' commands were obeyed. His commands were obeyed. When Christ spoke, this dead young man heard his voice and he obeyed. I can't help but think and wonder, do you think that he wanted to come back? I wonder. If he was already in the presence of God, did he want to come back? I don't know. It's just something I'm wondering in my head. But he hears Jesus' voice, and Jesus says, hey, come back now. Arise. And he comes back and he obeys. It says, so he who was dead sat up and began to speak. Suddenly the color returned to the young man's face. His dead, lifeless eyes suddenly began to twitch and to focus on the blue sky above him as he blinks, regaining focus. And then as he's wrapped in his burial shroud, just get that picture in your mind. As he's wrapped in his burial shroud, he just sits straight up and begins talking. Can you imagine that scene? I find it interesting. He sits up, starts talking, and we have no idea what he said. I would love to just know what he said. Maybe one day in heaven we'll find out what he said. I don't know. Maybe it was something mundane. Maybe he just said, hey, Mom, you look kind of tired. Have you been crying? I don't know. Maybe he said, hey, I'm kind of hungry. Haven't eaten in a while. Anybody got some food? Maybe he looked around and said, who are all these people? Or perhaps he looked straight at Jesus and thanked and glorified him for what he had done. We don't know. But can you imagine the reaction of the crowd? If you're one of the ones holding the coffin, and suddenly the dead man wrapped in his burial clothes sits up and starts talking, what are you doing? You running? I don't think I'm going to keep holding that coffin very much longer. I can't help but picture all the mummy movies. You know what I'm talking about? And you just picture it, that thing just sits up, and every horror movie you ever watch where the suddenly coming up out of, oh my goodness, no. I would pretty sure I would be afraid, and I'd be dropping that thing and heading as far away as I could. Give some people between me and the zombie, okay? That would be where I would be, but the crowd had to be in shock. Think about this young man's dear mom. What was her reaction? Jesus had told her to what? Don't cry. Let me ask you something. Do you think she started crying when she saw her boy sit up and start talking? She went from tears of sorrow to tears of joy and happiness streaming down her face. Listen, this young man's miracle is the picture of our future. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 18 says, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Listen, the same voice that raised that young man from his coffin will one day shout like a trumpet across this planet. And every molecule of God's physically dead children, everyone who knows Christ, they will hear his voice and they will rise. This young man's miracle is our future miracle. One day, if we die before his return, we'll each get to hear Jesus' majestic voice say, "Get up, Travis. Get up, Chris. Get up, Thomas. Doesn't matter who it is. Get up. It's time to come home." What a day that'll be. So, we see Jesus raises the dead. Let's now take a quick look at the effect of the miracle. The effect of the miracle. Verses 16 and 17. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. Let me show you three things here. I think I have three, right? Yes. Yeah, three things. Number one, first effect is a holy fear was produced. That word fear in verse 16 comes from the Greek word phobos, where we get our English word phobia. It says that everyone who saw this miracle, everyone feared after seeing it. Whenever God's presence and God's power are displayed in such an amazing manner, it produces fear in people. I know what some of you are thinking, as we talked about a moment ago. Yeah, if I saw a corpse sit up in a coffin and start talking, I'd have a little bit of fear too. But that's not the kind of fear that this verse is talking about. This was a holy fear. It wasn't a bad fear, it was a good kind of fear. They weren't afraid because a corpse was talking. It was a fear and an awe and a reverence at the power of God on display. Yes, we need to fear God, but that fear should always involve an awe of God and a reverence for who He is. It's a fear that helps us realize we need to consider how we live our lives before a holy, righteous God. We live in a day and age where the vast majority of people, let's be real honest, most people have no fear of God at all, do they? There is no fear of God, even in some Christian circles. We find people speaking God's name flippantly, using it profanely. They despise His word. Understand, it is a dangerous thing to live without the fear of God in your heart. So we should learn the lesson from them that we need to fear and have a holy fear of God. Secondly, we see that God was glorified. It says they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited His people." Now they said this for a very specific reason, because here's what happened. Over 500 years earlier, the prophet Elijah had gone to another small town. And guess what? This small town was in the exact same region as the city of Nain. And at that small town in this region, he met a widow at the gate of the town. Does that sound familiar? He met a widow at the gate of the town, just as Jesus did at Nain. That widow had an only son who became ill and died, as happened at the city of Nain. When Elijah prayed to the Lord and this boy came back to life, because the Lord heard Elijah's prayer, the woman said to Elijah in 1 Kings 17:24, she said, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Listen, Jesus, at the Father's direction, sovereignly performed a miracle that in many ways nearly duplicated Elijah's miracle from 500 years before. The language of Luke's account is conclusive of that because it records the exact same words for Jesus that he did for Elijah. It says that just as Elijah gave him back to his mother, Jesus gave him back to his mother. The wording is identical. The language is identical. The results are similar. The widow became convinced that Elijah was a man of God, a prophet, and that he spoke God's word. Here, after Jesus' miracle, we read that they glorified God and said, what? A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. Now we know and we understand that Jesus was more than just a great prophet. But the people, in their limited knowledge, were attributing a title to him that showed they believed God was doing a special work in their time. In their minds, Jesus had come in Elijah-like power, except for one difference. Elijah had to stretch himself over the boy 3 times, where Jesus only had to speak the word. And the young man obeyed and came to life. The people understood this miracle was of divine origin, and thus they glorified God accordingly. We see one final result here, and that is that Jesus' fame was spread. It says this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. Listen, news of this miracle quickly spread throughout the entire region. I would imagine so. If you saw someone come back to life, wouldn't you be telling the story? I sure would. And it became very widely known, and Jesus became even more popular among the people. It was spread so wide that we're told in verse 18 that word of it reached even John the Baptist, who was sitting in prison waiting for execution. It reached everywhere. And so understand, his fame was spread. Now, I'm going to finish up with I didn't have this in my notes, but it was one of the things I came across as I was studying. Here's an interesting thing about the city of Nain. The city of Nain, obviously, we only know it. This is the only time this city is ever mentioned in the Bible. What is interesting to me is that this city is known only for this young man's resurrection. They were heading to a cemetery, a gravesite. Guess what is the only thing still remaining of this city in antiquity today? The only thing you're going to find there, the graveside. It's cut into, the tombs are cut into a hillside there. It's the only reminder of this city's existence. Just think, so here is this city that was a site of one of Jesus' greatest miracles. Someone was on their way to that gravesite, and Jesus stopped them before they ever got there. What a powerful reminder today. There's the gravesite that boy was supposed to go to, but he never made it because Jesus raised him back to life. So, just a little tidbit of thought there for you. Next week, we're going to look at Jesus as he stills the storm. Now, I have a question for you. I told you I had a question. I was going to save it to the end. Next week was supposed to be my our last miracle that we were going to look at. I want to ask you, do you want to keep going in the miracles, or do you want to move on to a little something else? I'm okay either way. But as I was going through it, we're only at about, next week will be miracle number 10 of about 30. Do you want to push forward to some more miracles? All right. I'll tell you what I'd love to do is if you have a certain miracle we haven't covered yet that you would like to see us cover, let me know. And maybe we'll get it in there. But we may extend this just for a few more weeks and see where we go with it. But I'm enjoying looking at the miracles. I think there's so much to gather from them. But what I don't want to do is drag it out so far that we get bored with it, okay? I don't want to do that. So anyway. All right. God bless you for being here. And look at that. We're done 15 minutes early tonight.